On the morning of October 1st, 1970, Victor Glushkov walked into Stalin's former office inside the Kremlin and counted the chairs around a long table set on a red carpet. He had taken the overnight train from Kiev to defend the most ambitious computer network any government had ever proposed. The plan carried the name OGAS. Its purpose was to wire the entire Soviet economy into a single real-time system, years before the American ARPANET carried its first message between two machines. Glushkov brought the engineering and the mathematics with him. For most of a decade, he had prepared for this exact half hour in front of the Politburo. Two of the chairs at that table sat empty. The General Secretary, Leonid Brezhnev, had not come. Neither had the Prime Minister, Alexei Kosygin. These were the two men most likely to approve the project, and on the single morning that would decide its future, both were somewhere else. What happened in that room over the next hour is usually told as proof that Soviet technology simply could not keep pace with the West. That telling is wrong. The empty chairs are the first clue to why. You already understand the problem Glushkov set out to solve because you have lived inside smaller versions of it your whole working life. Waiting for a slot on a shared machine taught you the first lesson. A job would sit in a queue, while the data you were working from grew older by the hour. Anyone who has run a large system knows the quiet dread of acting on numbers that were stale before they arrived. Now imagine that same problem stretched across 11 time zones and the better part of a continent. The scale is the part that breaks the intuition. A delay you could absorb inside a single plant becomes paralysis when it is multiplied across 100,000 factories. And a small error in one report becomes a national misallocation by the time it is added up at the top. The Soviet Union managed the largest planned economy in history using paper forms, telephone calls, and telegrams. Planners in Moscow set production targets for tens of thousands of enterprises, and each enterprise reported back through a chain of ministries that had every reason to round its figures in a flattering direction. By the time a number reached the top of that chain, it described a country that no longer existed. You know exactly what that latency does to a control loop. Steering becomes guesswork when the readings are months old and quietly massaged on the way up. Glushkov saw this the way an engineer sees a feedback problem, not the way a politician sees a slogan. His answer was the answer you would have reached for as well. He wanted to build a network. The design placed a computer inside every significant enterprise, linked those machines to regional centers, and linked the regional centers to a hub in Moscow so that accurate information could move in something close to real time. That same wiring, which carried a factory's output figures, could just as easily carry a corrected plan back down. It would be a control system for a country, built from the same parts you use to control a refinery or a railroad. The idea was sound, it was also early, and being early in the Soviet Union turned out to be dangerous. The Soviet investment in cybernetics was never a fringe enthusiasm. It grew into a national research program with real institutional weight. Glushkov founded the Institute of Cybernetics in Kiev in 1962. And by the late 1970s, it employed more than 5,000 people, which made it one of the largest computing research centers in the world. From that base, Glushkov drew up a blueprint whose scale still reads as staggering. As proposed in 1962, OGAS was a three-tier network. One central computing center would sit in Moscow. Around 200 mid-level centers would operate in major cities. As many as 20,000 terminals would stand in the factories, mines, and depots that mattered most to the economy. All of them communicating in real time over the existing telephone system. The architecture even allowed any terminal to reach any other terminal directly. Set that against the American picture of the same era. When ARPANET switched on at the end of 1969, it connected exactly 4 sites. The ambition did not go unnoticed abroad. As early as 1962, American officials treated Soviet cybernetics as a genuine strategic threat. Arthur Schlesinger, an advisor to President Kennedy, warned that an all-out Soviet commitment to these methods could hand Moscow a real advantage in running its industries. The fear in Washington was not that the Soviets would fall behind, it was that they might pull ahead. By the time Glushkov carried the plan to the Kremlin in 1970, the numbers attached to it were enormous. His estimate ran to roughly 20 billion rubles, spread across about 30 years, with a workforce of more than 200,000 people needed to build and run it. He argued that the network would pay for itself several times over within its first 15 years through sheer gains in efficiency. On paper, the case was strong. The Soviet state had spent comparable sums on the bomb and on the space program without blinking. A nationwide network sat well within its proven reach. Money is where the OGAS story stops being a story about engineering. The plan did not fail on the merits of its design. It failed on the question of who would pay for it and who would control it once it existed. In a command economy, every ruble of capital was allocated from the center, which meant OGAS had to compete directly with defense, agriculture, and the space effort for the same pool of funds. A project measured in tens of billions of rubles could not be slipped in quietly. It needed a powerful sponsor and a clear home inside the bureaucracy. Glushkov understood that the network was, at bottom, a machine for moving information about money and goods. He went further than mere accounting and proposed using the system to handle payments electronically and to push the Soviet Union toward an economy with far less paper currency in circulation. To the engineers, this was efficiency. For the ministries that already controlled how money and information flowed, it read as a direct threat to their reason for existing. That threat became concrete because of where the project was housed. OGAS was placed under the Central Statistical Administration, the agency responsible for collecting the country's economic data. Putting the network there told every other ministry that one rival would soon sit on top of the most valuable resource in a planned economy, which was accurate information about everyone else. The Ministry of Finance, which lived by controlling the flow of rubles, saw the danger immediately. A real-time network owned by a competing agency would make the finance ministry less necessary. The economic model that was supposed to save the system instead handed every powerful institution a reason to strangle it. Here is where the usual explanation falls apart. The common story says the Soviet internet failed because the Soviet system was too centralized, too rigid, and too far behind in technology to build such a thing. Every part of that story is either wrong or backwards. The technology existed, the mathematics was sound, and the scientists ranked among the best in the world. What killed OGAS was almost the opposite of too much central control. It died from too little of it. Benjamin Peters, the media historian who wrote the definitive account of these efforts, put the paradox in a single line. The capitalists behaved like socialists, while the socialists behaved like capitalists. He meant something precise by that. The American ARPANET was built with patient, well-managed government money and a culture of open collaboration between universities and the Defense Department. Researchers shared results, pooled resources, and worked toward a common design because the funding structure rewarded cooperation. The supposedly individualist Americans, in other words, networked their nation by acting collectively. Inside the Soviet Union, the reverse happened. In the country built on collective ownership, the ministries and agencies behaved like rival firms fighting over a market. Each agency guarded its own budget, its own data, and its own turf. A shared national network was not a common good to them but a danger, because a rival agency that controlled it could use that control against them. The historian Slava Garovich, working from the same archives independently, reached the same conclusion. Soviet officials discovered many ways to adopt computers without ever surrendering control to a unified system, and their hunger for keeping that control is precisely what broke the network apart. Think about what a planned economy actually runs on. It does not run on money the way a market does. The thing it runs on is information. The reports that tell the center what exists, what was produced, and what is needed. Whoever controlled that information held the real power, and every ministry knew it. A truthful, real-time network would have stripped that power away from the people who guarded the paperwork and handed a clean picture to everyone at once. The ministries were not defending an ideology when they fought OGAS. They were defending the one asset that made each of them indispensable. None of this was new in 1970. The first attempt to network the Soviet Union had come and gone more than a decade earlier. In 1959, a military engineer named Anatoly Kitov sent Khrushchev a detailed proposal, later known as the Red Book, for a single state network of computing centers that would serve the army and the civilian economy at once. His clever idea was to run economic calculations at night on the military's machines while the generals slept. The military refused. Sharing its computers and its data with civilian planners struck the defense establishment as an attack on its own power, and the proposal was buried. Kitov was expelled from the Communist Party and pushed out of his career. The man was different and the decade was different, yet the outcome did not change because the institutional logic stayed exactly the same. Return now to those two empty chairs. Their emptiness was not an accident of scheduling. Brezhnev and Kosygin stayed away because backing OGAS meant taking sides in a vicious fight between ministries, and neither man wished to spend his authority on it. Into that vacuum stepped Vasily Garbuzov, the Minister of Finance, who had every reason to see the project buried. He did not argue against networks on technical grounds. Instead, he stood up and described how computers had been set up to flash colored lights and play music for laying hens during a recent visit to Minsk, and he suggested the country focus on humble uses like that one. The argument was absurd on its face. Its motive was not. Garbuzov wanted the money and the authority kept inside his own ministry, and a real-time network run by the statisticians threatened both. Glushkov defended the plan for the better part of half an hour, and he did not lack sympathizers in the room. What he lacked was a patron with the rank to overrule a minister, and the two men who could have played that part had stayed home. This is the structural cause that the backwardness story misses entirely. A planned economy is supposed to coordinate by command from the top. In practice, the Soviet bureaucracy operated as a set of rival institutions, each defending its own information and its own budget against all the others. No engineering plan, however brilliant, could overcome the fact that a unified network would expose every ministry's numbers to every other ministry and to the center. The system that most needed honest, shared, real-time information was the system least able to tolerate it. That October meeting did not kill OGAS outright. It did something quieter and more permanent. The Politburo approved the installation of computers at individual enterprises while refusing to fund the links that would join them into a network. Factories could keep their machines, but the connections between them were denied. Computers that cannot talk to one another are just isolated machines, and that is roughly what the decision produced. The retreat continued at the 24th Party Congress in 1971, which had been expected to authorize the full plan and instead endorsed only the spread of local management systems. After that, the Grand Network survived only as a stack of documents rather than a working system. Glushkov did not give up. He pushed a successor plan through the following years, and it too received too little funding and was never built. The pattern did not stop with OGAS. Across 30 years from Kitov's first letter in 1959 to the last Soviet years, scientists and reformers proposed national network after national network. Each one ran into the same wall of competing institutions, and each was scaled down, denied money, or quietly shelved. By the time the Soviet Union dissolved, the dream of a unified network had been given up entirely. The networks that finally reached ordinary citizens in the 1990s were not built by the state at all. They arrived through the same open cooperative model that had carried the American internet from 4 nodes to the whole world. A second decision, made in parallel, deepened the damage. In 1966, Soviet planners concluded that their own computer industry had fallen behind the West, and rather than back their indigenous designs, they chose to copy the American IBM system 360. Work on the clones began in 1968. And production of the resulting unified system machines, known as RIAD, started in 1972. The choice made sense in the short term and proved ruinous in the long term. It locked Soviet computing into permanently chasing an American target, and it pulled talent and funding away from original work. The same instinct that killed the network was at work here too. Copying IBM was safe. It protected existing institutions, and it required no agency to surrender control to a bold new system. While the Soviets argued and copied, ARPANET grew. Four nodes in 1969 became dozens, then hundreds, joined together by a research culture that rewarded sharing instead of hoarding. The protocols that became the modern internet were worked out in the open by people who published their results and built on one another's work. No contrast could be sharper. One side treated information as something to be pooled, the other treated it as something to be hidden, and that secrecy is what cost them the lead. Those who built OGAS were not gray functionaries. Glushkov's group in Kiev had a sense of humor about the strange utopia they were chasing. They invented a mock electronic state called cyberneticist, complete with its own joke passports, its own currency, and a robot mascot that played the saxophone. Their play was a way of imagining the connected society they believed they were building. The society never arrived, but the imagination behind it was real and serious. Glushkov kept working until the end. In 1981, a year before he died, he wrote a book explaining OGAS to Soviet schoolchildren, still convinced the future belonged to networked machines. He died in January 1982 at the age of 58 after a long illness. A book he had finished came out shortly afterward under the title Fundamentals of Paperless Computing, and in it he predicted a world where the computer would replace printed paper across daily life. That prediction proved correct. The world he described, though, was built somewhere other than the Soviet Union. You can still find the traces if you look. The Institute of Cybernetics he founded survives in Kiev and carries his name to this day. Students he trained went on to form a school of computer science that shaped the field across Eastern Europe for decades. His central ideas, real-time data, paperless records, a network reaching into every workplace, describe the ordinary infrastructure of the present. Every one of those ideas now runs underneath the modern economy. The one thing the Soviet version lacked was never a circuit or an algorithm. It was the willingness of powerful institutions to share what they knew. History remembers the Soviet failure as a failure of machines. The truth sat in two empty chairs on a red carpet in Stalin's old office. On an October morning in 1970, when the men who could have said yes chose not to be in the room. Those engineers had built everything except a system that powerful people were willing to share. If this is the kind of history you want told properly, subscribe and stay with the channel.